I bring this comic book up as a suggestion to a guest, and I brought it up again just talking about comics with a guest, and I realize more and more that people don't know about this comic. If people do know about this comic, they don't know the story behind the comic, which is just as good to me and is actually part of the comic. So when you read the comic, it's one of those things where you read the comic and you get the story behind the story. But I want to talk about it tonight because I think it's enough to get people into the comic, enough to go out and get it themselves. So let's see here. March is a trilogy of graphic novels created and written by the late civil rights activist leader and congressman representing Georgia's 5th District, John Lewis. The comic is based on the marches he led from Selma to Montgomery back in the mid 1960s across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The book is co created by author Andrew Aydin and artist Nate Powell. It is one of those very personal, historical retellings that draws you in and keeps you engaged from cover to cover. Now, a lot of people don't know that John Lewis made comic books later in his life. And like I said, I recommend this comic to a bunch of people, and it's always shocking to me how unaware they are of it. And so I thought, why not tell the whole story and do a proper presentation? When John Lewis was 15 years old and living in rural Alabama, 15 miles south of Montgomery, he first heard of Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and the Montgomery bus boycott through civil rights leader James Lawson, who was working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the FOR. The FOR was founded in 1915 by a group of pacifists and claims to be the largest, oldest interfaith peace and justice organization in the United States. Much later in 1955 and 1956, Glenn E. Smiley, a white Methodist minister, was assigned by the FOR to assist the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in the Montgomery bus boycott. The two, sitting behind Montgomery NAACP member and future co-founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, were seatmates on the first interracial bus ride in Montgomery. Smiley and FOR Executive Secretary and Director of Publications, Alfred Hassler, later spearheaded production and distribution of the 1957 comic book Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. The 1957 comic book, Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. Not long after, James Lawson introduced Lewis to the 10-cent 16-page comic book, which had a profound impact on him. The comic book demonstrated in clear fashion to Lewis the power of the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. Lawson became a mentor to Lewis, and Lewis began attending weekly meetings to discuss nonviolent protests, with the Montgomery Story serving as one of the guidelines. Lewis became a U.S. Congressman for Georgia's 5th Congressional District in 1987. While working on his 2008 re-election campaign, Lewis told his telecommunications and technology policy aide, Andrew Aydin, about the Montgomery Story and its influence on him. Aydin, who had been reading comics since his grandmother bought him a copy of Uncanny X-Men number 317, a classic, off of a Piggly Wiggly spinner rack when he was 8 years old, found a digital copy of the book on the internet and spent years tracking down an original print copy on eBay. Aydin repeatedly suggested that Lewis himself write a comic book. Lewis had previously written a traditional autobiography, Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement, co-authored with journalist Michael DeOrzo and published in 1998. A national bestseller, that book won the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, was selected as a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, was included on Newsweek magazine's list of 50 books for our times, and was named Nonfiction Book of the Year by the American Library Association. So then eventually, Lewis decided to commit to Aydin's project on the condition that Aydin write it with him. they're going to make a comic book. Aydin, who was in the middle of writing his master's thesis on the Montgomery story and how it helped inspire protest movements around the world, agreed to the project, which he calls a life-changing moment. Comics will change your life. Much of Aydin's work on the project was listening to Lewis dictate his life story, anecdotes of which Aydin had often heard Lewis relate to children, parents, and others visiting his office and transcribing it. That scene is in the comic book. It's fantastic. March starts with it jumps around in the timeline, but it basically has John Lewis in his office on Barack Obama's inauguration day, and he's about to go out to the inauguration, and he's entertaining some guests in his office. I think it's a mother and her kids or a grandmother and her kids, and so then he tells them the story. This is the kind of storytelling technique, jumping around in timelines, that works very well. It's seamless in a comic book. It could be clunky in a movie or a TV show, but it works in the comics medium. Eventually, they brought on artist Nate Powell into the project, and it's noted, get this, that Powell rendered a total of 300 real-life historical figures in the book. Powell's approach was to develop a visual shorthand for each real person he had to draw in the form of a master drawing to act as a reference template for that person's features, one that emphasized the person's skull structure in lieu of referring constantly to photo reference in the course of the project, so that the characters would not look too stale or photo derived. So I want to explain what he did there. He used photo reference. Nate Powell, the artist, used photo reference to draw what each of these 300 people were going to look like. So when he had to draw them again and again, he went back to his drawing, not the photo. See what I mean? So that way it matched the art and not different photos. This is something I've done too. It's a smart thing to do. It's having a master drawing, quote unquote. He employed lifestyle and illustration books from the 1950s and 60s, as well as Google searches to depict fashion and automobiles of given time periods accurately. In 2018, Lewis and Andrew Aydin co-wrote a sequel to March, the Trilogy, entitled Run. So check this out. I want to show you some of this stuff. So here's the book, The Montgomery Story. It was a 10-cent comic, 16 pages, including the cover. If you scroll down in the description of this podcast, you can find a link to this. You can read it yourself right there. It's pretty cool. You can download it too. It's a PDF, so you can download it. They're pretty good resolution scans, well enough to read. This is the book that Andrew Aydin, the co-author, tracked down an original copy of, which would be, I'd love to have this. But this is the book that inspired John Lewis to make March. So follow me here. 15-year-old John Lewis reads a comic book, inspires a life of civil rights activism immediately, like right away. Then he becomes a congressman. Then he makes comic books. Okay? If you can learn from a comic book, you can teach with a comic book. Here's some interior pages. This is pretty cool. It's all black and white. It's very well done. It's so dynamic. It's so passionate. The art will draw you in just as much as the story does. The lettering is loose and whimsical. It follows the panels. It leads your eye. So if you're not used to reading comics, it's left to right, top to bottom. You'll be able to follow this perfectly. It's totally legible. So then in 2018, Lewis and Andrew Aydin co-wrote a sequel to March, the Trilogy, entitled Run, which documents Lewis's life after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, including his leadership of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, conflict with the Ku Klux Klan, the Vietnam War, and the rise of the Black Power movement. Lewis said of the book, quote, "In sharing my story, it is my hope that a new generation will be inspired by Run to actively participate in the democratic process and help build a more perfect union here in America." End quote. L. Fury illustrated the book, while Nate Powell, who illustrated March, also contributed to the art. So it's a team effort. Strength in numbers. The book was eventually released in August 2021 after some delays, a year after Lewis's death, one of his last endeavors before he died. Now, this in my mind is the clearest example of how powerful the comic book medium can be. And it's why I get a little bent out of shape when people claim it's all just silly kid stuff. It's not. Comic books are much, much more than capes and masks. But even those books can have a profound impact on readers because whether the stuff of fiction or nonfiction is your thing, the juxtaposition of words and images creates a melody and a harmony in our minds that we interpret individually. We all may be reading the exact same story, but the story itself is a different experience for each of us.